Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd, and you're listening to the ITPro Podcast, where I'm once again joined by special guest co-host Keumars Afifi-Sabet. Keumars, nice to have you back with us.
Thanks, Adam. It's nice to be back, and hello to all our listeners.
So, Keumars, did you enjoy your bank holiday? It's hard to believe that was this week.
I know it seems ages ago, but yeah, we had a great time. We've been out a lot more recently, especially this weekend, going out to pubs, restaurants. It's been nice. Especially the weather wasn't too bad in places. I actually went to an outdoor theatre performance, which was great, in St Albans. How about yourself?
Oh, very nice. I've been filling it mostly with DIY, the traditional bank holiday activity. But it's nice to see things starting to get somewhat back to normal after the past couple of months of chaos, which brings us rather neatly onto this week's topic. Now, I want you to cast your mind back to the ancient time of 2019 and the things that we used to worry about in those far-off days. Now, in simpler times, when Corona was just a brand of beer, there were a few things that we predicted were going to dominate 2020. One, of course, was the forthcoming US presidential election, where incumbent Donald Trump is defending his position against Joe Biden. The other, however, was Brexit. While the UK and European governments have been grappling with the ongoing COVID-19 situation, the clock has steadily been ticking down to the point where the Brexit transition period ends and Britain fully completes its exit from the European Union. This will occur on the 31st of December, less than 4 months from now, for anyone that's keeping track. And while we're not going to get into the political side of the whole Brexit debate, there are still a number of unanswered questions around the issue, with the potential cybersecurity implications being a big one. Now, leaving the EU affects more than just travel and exports, and the government has thus far issued fairly scant guidance to businesses on what the forthcoming changes could mean from an IT security perspective. So, in this week's episode, we are going to delve into the cybersecurity ramifications of the Brexit process and what businesses need to do to protect themselves going forward.
So, of course, Brexit was set to dominate the news agenda during 2020. Of course, that was, as you mentioned, before COVID-19 knocked it straight off the agenda. Of course, every European country, including the UK, although the UK was lagging a few weeks behind the rest of the EU generally on COVID, every European country has had to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. What that's done, effectively, is put a block on a lot of the negotiations and discussions that were taking place between the UK and the wider EU. That has then had, well, an even greater knock-on effect on some of these subjects that they were discussing, and many of these include data sovereignty, cybersecurity, and so on.
Yeah, there's a lot of different moving parts that go into the Brexit process, and a lot of these are, as you mentioned, going to have serious knock-on effects. And one of the ones that I wanted to touch on to start off with is data residency. Now, this is something that a lot of companies have already started to grapple with, thanks to the GDPR legislation, which came into force just over 2 years ago. Now, when we leave the EU, the ICO has already said that the essential principles of GDPR will still continue to apply. Most of them have been replicated by the UK's own Data Protection Act. But what potential implications for data sovereignty are we likely to see from the eventual finalised Brexit?
Well, I suppose it does really depend on what kind of agreement we strike with the EU. Of course, once the transition period ends, because at the moment it's been fairly much the same. There hasn't been any great difference between the previous regime. Of course, we've had GDPR for a couple of years now, and post-withdrawal, it's largely been the same for many businesses. I think the real risk for businesses and organisations will come on December the 31st once this transitionary period ends, and the nature of the future relationship when it comes to data adequacy and the transfer of data from the EU to the UK. Because as far as I know, I think the transfer of data from the UK to the EU will be largely uninterrupted. It's more the other way around, and it depends on whether we can reach this data adequacy position where the EU recognises the UK as being a third country, but one that has data laws and data principles compatible with its own, i.e. GDPR. Of course, it should be quite easy for us to get to that point. There are some issues, though. There is a queue. There are lots of other countries who would love to strike a data adequacy agreement with the EU. And there are some murmurs of discontent with the UK's discussions with the US and the US data laws, and how we might tweak or alter our own data laws in order to establish a trade agreement with the US. And of course, the US has data laws that are far weaker than the standard of GDPR.
And it's worth bearing in mind that the EU-US Data Protection Shield agreement for the transfer of personal data between the EU and the US has already been ruled invalid by the European Court of Justice. And the EU Commissioner for Justice has said that the courts need more time, essentially, to fully consider the ramifications of any similar agreement. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that similar decisions and similar discussions will need to take place before any firm and finalised agreement with the EU and the UK is put into place.
Yeah, indeed. And I think the trouble for many businesses is we are getting to that point where there are only 4 months in it, and I don't think there is clarity. I think, touching again on COVID, the EU's had to delay its decision making to some extent, just because there hasn't been enough time to discuss such matters as Brexit. There have been more important things on the horizon.
So, speaking of transfer between the EU and the UK, one other very important area is the transfer of knowledge when it comes to cyber threats themselves. So, intelligence sharing between law enforcement bodies. This is something that has been raised a number of times in relation to the Brexit debate. The UK is going to lose certain privileges and certain relationships when it comes to this kind of information sharing. It won't be privy to the same level of threat intelligence that it was previously. And while law enforcement organisations in the EU will continue to cooperate with UK law enforcement where necessary on international cybercrime cases, there won't be the same level of cooperation that there is now, which could potentially result in spikes in European cybercriminals exploiting businesses in the UK.
Yeah, and the UK is already quite a big target for cybercriminals. This is something that they would happily exploit as and when the situation arose.
Another crucial element of this is that even if formal intelligence sharing agreements are reached between UK law enforcement and the rest of the Europol network, the UK will no longer have a say in the decisions and operations of Europol and other similar agencies that it currently has a stake in.
This is something that the UK is starting to notice, this level of exclusion from EU decision making. There was an issue, I think there was an issue in July where there was an EU cybersecurity meeting to discuss Huawei, and the UK, given it's still technically in this transitionary period, was initially invited to attend and then had been disinvited. I would imagine the UK didn't necessarily react well to this, but it's a sign of things to come should the UK leave without establishing some kind of agreement. there's a sense that I feel the UK will have less influence on these supranational issues. I think it's worth noting what the EU would like what its ideal scenario is. And it was Michel Barnier, who is still the head of the task force for negotiations with the UK, who said that he would like some form of cybersecurity pact to be formed with the UK post-Brexit. What he essentially said this would look like, or should look like, is an agreement that includes the exchange of information on cybersecurity incidents, techniques, some threat analysis and best practice, including when there might be cybersecurity incidents that target the functioning of democratic systems. I mean, I would imagine that includes stuff like disinformation and so on. There also needs to be some kind of capacity, he says, to respond jointly to any attacks. And I suppose one example would be if there was another WannaCry, or if there was something that affected not just one or two countries, but several, and spread to businesses all over the place. But of course, it remains to be seen whether we can even strike such an agreement.
So, outside of the direct political ramifications of Brexit, another issue that it's worth businesses bearing in mind is the potential impact that Brexit could have on their supply chains. Now, supply chain security and supply chain attacks is something that is becoming more and more prevalent as time goes on. More and more cybercriminals are exploiting weaknesses within companies' supply chains to indirectly attack targets. And as trade, and particularly international trade, becomes more strained and slightly different in terms of how it operates, this is something that could potentially prove to be very problematic. If companies' supply chains are disrupted by things like new tariffs or stricter import laws, or even just economic changes dictating a shift in suppliers, this is something that cybercriminals can potentially exploit to attack targets both in the UK and in the EU through different suppliers and weaknesses that are introduced during the changeover of supply chains. One of these attack methods that can exploit weaknesses in supply chains is island hopping, which is when cybercriminals essentially use companies further down the pecking order, if you like, further down the supply chain, to get to companies that they actually want to attack. So, say, for example, you are a large government organization. You, as a government organization, might have very secure defenses, but your partners and their partners might not. So if you can find a way into if as an attacker you can find a way into one of your target's partners, you can move laterally through the network and through that supply chain up to where your target actually is, without ever having to directly attack your target from outside. Now, this is something that is a problem even outside of Brexit, but as I mentioned previously, the extra confusion that is introduced when supply chains are thrown into disarray through, changes in customs and export laws and things like that, provides a very fertile ground for these kind of attacks to be mounted.
I think there are always going to be changes in regulations or laws or and so on, but this seems to be something that is happening on a much grander scale all at once, and there's a risk that so much can change overnight for so many businesses, and they might have to reassess their supply chains, how they go about their business on a day-to-day basis, or perhaps in a completely different manner to what they're used to.
And finally, arguably the most pressing change that Brexit will bring for businesses in terms of cybersecurity is skills and the availability of skilled cybersecurity talent. Now, this is something that is already a problem for businesses. Skilled security personnel are hard to come by. They often command very high salaries, and stricter immigration laws post-Brexit could mean a sudden and very acute lack of available talent for security teams.
I suppose the aspect that highlights immigration would be the end of free movement. We will see the end of free movement as we know it, which might have its own ramifications for how people see the UK, or how people feel that they would like to work in the UK from abroad. There might be problems, for example, attracting talent, which of course is a problem in the first place for many companies, but that could also lead to a problem in retaining talent too.
And various trade bodies have been pushing the government to confirm the availability of visas for these kind of highly skilled tech workers and security workers in order to try and secure that supply line, if you like, and that pipeline outside of the existing freedom of movement laws. But one of the very few benefits of the current situation is the rise of remote working, which arguably could help nip this problem in the bud. Pretty much all organizations now have had to adapt to remote working in some fashion. So the potential now for effectively outsourcing security capabilities, or bringing remote employees from places within Europe which have those kind of high concentrations of tech and security skills, that's much more feasible for companies now than it was, say, 6 months ago.
Yeah, I feel this is something that could be said of many companies, if not most companies, that had an element of remote working beforehand, but have had to rely on it for pretty much the entire workforce. I know Facebook, for example, is talking about a permanent shift to remote working, with by the year 2030 or so, half of its workforce being remotely based. This could mean, while there could be problems with the new immigration system, I think we have a points-based immigration policy, which we don't know how that's going to be implemented in practice. It could be fine, but there could also be issues with securing visas and so on. But it could mean that companies will be able to attract that kind of talent in a way that previously they might have been slightly concerned about.
And it also opens up potential talent pools outside of Europe as well. While Europe has a wealth of skilled cybersecurity professionals within it, there are also places like Israel and the US that also have very high concentrations of tech skills. And if you're operating a fully or mostly distributed security team, there is a lot more scope for bringing those individuals into it if you're not having to worry about things like, whether or not they can make it into the office, or, what kind of working hours they're operating. So in this one area, this actually could prove to be a kind of oblique benefit for some security teams.
Almost a silver lining in some respect. You're right.
Yeah, exactly.
And a related issue to all of this is, of course, the concerns about a brain drain with skills and talent, not only in the security sector, but the wider tech sector being exfiltrated, for want of a better way of putting it. There have been various studies over the last few years, of course, when the withdrawal agreement was being intensely negotiated, that there would be questions about how that affects the pool of skills available to UK companies, and how organisations might struggle to retain talent, as we touched on before. I suppose that there has been some concern that there is a general trend, regardless of Brexit, where tech talent is perhaps more attracted to higher salaries, for example, in the US.
So, before we wrap up, let's take a second and talk about the key takeaways for businesses as we look forward to the end of the year and the end, indeed, of the transition period. And for me, the key things for businesses to bear in mind is that they need to be ready to implement new guidance both from the UK government and from the EU as it becomes available. And they need to look at their talent pipelines and ensure that they are going to be in a position to maintain the flow of talent that they need as freedom of movement comes to an end.
I suppose it's worth mentioning that at the moment, for a lot of companies out there who were perhaps worried about the effect on Brexit on these matters, for a lot of them, they have faced some disruption already this year due to COVID-19. And while it might be a problem that preoccupies them in the immediate term, the spectre of Brexit coming over the horizon might change things yet. So it's important for these businesses to stay on top of all the information that comes through. Of course, I don't think we yet know what the future relationship will look like. Negotiations are still not really moving forwards. However, I do imagine we'll have some certainty by the end of the year. At the moment, at least, I don't see a situation where we'll extend that transitionary period.
No, an extension isn't looking likely by all accounts. At the end of the day, the fundamentals of cybersecurity are going to stand you in as good stead after Brexit as they are now. Making sure that your fundamental cybersecurity policies are robust and are regularly updated is going to keep you as defended then as it is now. So the key for businesses is to focus on the basics, but remain alert for changes. And at the end of the day, I think that's all any of us can do in this situation.
Well, exactly.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week, but thanks once again, Keumars, for joining me.
Thanks, Adam. It was great to be back.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes and even more on our website at www.itpro.co.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast wherever you find your podcasts, and make sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. We'll be back next week with more in-depth analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.